Welcome to the We're Doing It Wrong podcast, a production of WDIW Media, hosted by Joseph Pazar and inspired by David Michael Slater's book, We're Doing It Wrong, 25 Ideas in Education That Just Don't Work and How to Fix Them. Today you'll hear a conversation with David Carter, and he is a member of the State Board of Education for District 2 in the state of Nevada, and that covers northern Nevada, much of it. It was a real privilege to speak with Mr. Carter. I think there's probably nothing better a politician can engage in with regards to communication than having a long-form conversation, particularly with educators. And so I was very pleased that he was so transparent and willing to get specific about policy ideas while also speaking generally about education, the state thereof. So a huge thanks to Mr. Carter and his willingness to come on the podcast. And I hope you enjoy our conversation. Without further ado, I bring you the State of Nevada Board of Education member David Carter, serving District 2. And I am here with Nevada State Board member David Carter. David, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
We are really pleased to speak with you. We've got all kinds of questions. You're in a unique position, being on a State Board of Education, I think, to give us a bird's eye view of what's going on in education. But before we launch into that, can you give our listeners a brief outline of your path to the State Board of Education for Nevada?
Sure. I spent 33 years as an accountant. 25 years working in school business in California school districts. And so my emphasis has always been from the budget side and trying to help maximize the dollars that the districts get. Had some health issues in 2012, so I retired and we moved up to Carson, because we had knew the area from when I had been in the Mono County Board of Education. And after spending time here and knowing what schools were like, I decided to run for the school board, the state school board. It's a little bit different from California in that California is obviously a lot bigger, but I felt I could make an impression. Ran against Pat Hickey, who had been appointed after Dave Cook's decease, and Pat had resigned from the state legislature, and he had been on the education committee for the assembly, and I ran against him and defeated him 2 years ago for a 4-year term, so I have 2 years more on my term.
And I'm curious, what platform items or large change items did you run on in your victory?
One of them was Common Core, still having problems dealing with that because the state board and many in the legislature still support that. Also in striving to provide more control for the local school districts and less at the state level. Obviously, that's going to take some work through the legislature also, but I feel that having a voice in there with that opinion is important rather than having everyone think that the state and the feds know best.
Yeah, that's an interesting
effort.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and that's an interesting point. Could you give us just a brief idea of the difference in terms of decision-making that occurs at a state board in comparison to a district board of education? So what kind of decisions does the state board make that are above and beyond what a district board can make?
Well, a big portion of what the state board works on is implementing what the most recent legislature has passed. So, for example, one of the big big items that we've been dealing with recently is regulations on bullying for the various school districts based on the laws that were passed in the 2017 legislature. And so we deal with the board takes regulations that first have been worked out in the Department of Education. They take and they pass that through the legislative, the LCB, which reviews it for legal and everything regarding there. And then there are hearings held to get public input. And then once that has passed, then they're brought for us as a board to review and adopt or amend as we feel. But we are limited in that the legislature's already passed a bill. And so we're trying to implement that with as little, how could I say, as little impact on the districts as possible, from my standpoint. You know, with as little a little change as possible to what they're already operating on. But obviously there are others in the board who feel that we have a mandate to control everything that the districts do.
You know, I'm sensing in your responses that you really value local control over education, and then you alluded to this idea of Common Core standards. So could you expound on your view of the Common Core state standards and then the state board's role in the adoption thereof, and how that works in terms of who actually makes the decision of what learning standards are to be taught throughout the school systems in a state like Nevada?
Sure. Well, during my term in my 25 years working in California, I dealt many years with No Child Left Behind. And No Child Left Behind has now been passed by Every Student Succeeds Act, but both of them are pretty much the same. Those who favored both of those at the federal level were pushing for Common Core standards, where Common Core standards would make it so that more districts are similar. And my feeling is that that's a decision local, that, you know, they shouldn't try and make everybody the same. If I could make a comparison, that would be like trying to make the standards of Harvard similar to UNR. Now, I feel UNR is not a bad education system, but certainly the students that end up going to Harvard in most are usually much more educated and have much more going for them than those that would go to UNR. And if you try and make both of those equal, Harvard's going to be hurt. And I feel that that's the way it is with the Common Core for the districts. We could have, one of the reasons I feel that we're at the low point right now, we're ranked 51 out of the 50 states plus Washington, D.C. And one of those reasons is because we've put these standards in and it has put us down. California used to be one of the best states in the nation, and they're now round the middle, I feel, because of the decisions they've made with their educational system, such as implementing Common Core. So it doesn't help to make everybody, you're never going to make everybody the same. And if you try to, you may bring some of the lower folks up some, but you're going to bring the better folks way down.
Do you think then it makes sense to have a common set of standards as like the baseline, so everybody has to accomplish at least this much, but then allow a lot of autonomy beyond that? Is that would that be a fair? I don't know if it's a counterpoint, but parallel point to what you're saying?
Yeah, I have no problem with having a baseline and then allowing from to go up above there. But the way the regulations at the federal level and the state level are written now, you don't get a lot of points for implementing new things. You get more points for keeping the standard quo.
So I'm curious about the notion of Nevada being 51st in the nation, and it sounded like you attributed part of that to the lack of autonomy of school districts. So we're all kind of bound by this common set of standards. I think the standards have been adopted, the Common Core, in some form by 42 states. So while that definitely could be a factor, it's not enough to explain why we are 51st, because we're competing with 42 other states that are using the same standards who aren't 51st. So it's an interesting point that you brought up, that we are last in the game here. What other reasons do you think are playing into that?
I think part of it is, and I think you would find this in many of the 42 that you mentioned, is a reliance on administration. One of the things that I have been fighting with Washoe School District is a heavy emphasis on administration. I believe there is a certain need for that, but it is more important that we provide assistance to our schools. The biggest portion of administration I feel is necessary is at the site. Your deans, your assistant principals, and your principal. That part of administration is absolute necessity. Supporting the teachers in becoming great teachers and teaching our students becoming great teachers. In my years in administration, because obviously I was working from the accounting side, I do understand that there is a level of administration that is necessary, but too often, especially on the curriculum side, there are too many administrators trying to design new programs to keep their jobs and to come up with a better way to teach, when I think most of that should come from the actual teachers themselves. But each teacher brings their own experiences and would be more able to understand how they can be a better teacher, rather than having a district curriculum or even a state curriculum telling everybody that the same procedures work for everybody.
I wonder if you feel as though a lot of the systems in place are needlessly complex. I had the joy of reading through the Nevada plan, the funding model for the state of Nevada, and I don't pretend to understand how it all works, but because it struck me as being pretty involved. And then on top of that, there's just a plethora of grant opportunities. And so I wonder if school districts are combating this immense complexity with a lot of administration whose job it is to secure those kinds of funds, remain in compliance with all the strings and requirements that come with certain funds. And if we were to simplify the way schools were funded, if that would remove some of the need for additional administration. I'm wondering if you would agree with that assessment in any way, or disagree with it.
Oh, yeah. In fact, especially at the smaller districts that I worked at that was my career, I spent a great deal of time, rather than administering the accounting department, working on the finance side of those grants that people had applied for, filing various reports, collecting data that they needed, and a lot of times some of these grants weren't very big, but they took a lot of time to fill out the reports. And knowing what had to go into those reports, not only from the reporting side with the accounting, but also from the curriculum side, I think we need to have a much better management system, being able to have a simpler way of reporting everything, especially since a lot of these reports end up going to the federal Department of Education anyway. And so, mainstreaming it so that you're not collecting the data 2 and 3 and 4 times for different groups, and instead just compiling one set of data that can be used for all of these grants.
And then in terms of just raw dollar amount, so the per pupil spending that is provided in the state of Nevada, I'm wondering if you feel that needs to be increased since we are 51st. And I think the last I saw, we were under the national average of per pupil spending by just over $3,000. So I'm wondering how you feel about the current level of funding. Is it just a case of misallocation and top heaviness, or do we actually need more money?
I think both. I think having more money would obviously benefit the state. One thing to be careful of, though, when you're looking at that, is the cost of operations as far as cost of living in different areas, comparing Reno to Vegas, for example, comparing Nevada to California. It costs a lot more to operate a district in many areas of California than it does in Nevada. And Utah has one of the lowest, at times they've had been the lowest per pupil spending, and yet they have one of the best rates of comparison as far as educational comparisons to the other states. And so it isn't just how much is spent, but again, like you were saying, the allocation. I think more what I'm used to calling unrestricted spending going to the various districts rather than restricted where you have to apply for a grant, or where they use money to, like the victory accounts and some of these others which are targeted to specific students. With one exception, having been in education so far long, I do see a need for setting aside a certain amount for special education, because that is a very costly area that, especially the way that it is required by courts and by the federal Department of Education right now. But with that aside, everything else, I think, is open for discussion and open for reallocation, and certainly more money wouldn't hurt. But trying to say that we need to spend as much as California, when California has areas like LA and San Francisco where they're spending more because the cost of living there is like comparing apples and oranges.
Absolutely. I noted that states such as California and Alaska, actually where I started my career, in New York and other states as well, were really on the top end of that distribution of per pupil funding. But then I looked at the cost of living, particularly for Reno, and I can't recall now the site that I looked this up on, but I was impressed with the notion that Nevada was pretty close to the average in terms of the national cost of living, but yet we were still over $3,000 below the national spending per pupil. So then I took the liberty of multiplying the gap between how much we spend per student and what the nation on an average does by the student population of my district in northern Nevada, and I think it came out close. It was just under $200 million. So I thought, gosh, that's nearly a third of what our district currently spends. So it left me at least with the impression that, we are underfunded, as well as I think some of the points you make very well that, that we need to really be looking at how we're using those funds, and the states such as Utah that you cite that seem to be using their dollars very well. So I'm curious as to how the State Board of Education plays a role in the funding situation. Is it completely controlled by the state legislator in terms of every detail of how allocations are made, or are you guys influencing that process?
The only area where we have any real play in that would be as we allocate grants that have been submitted by the various districts for the restricted funding. So everything, the unrestricted funding is completely decided by the legislature, and what they decide is going to be appropriate. So if we were able to get more, especially more even to the average of the 51 states, then that would make a big difference. One fear I have with that, though, is because you have Washoe and Clark so much bigger than the others, I feel that there has to be a kicker in there for the other 15 districts to be able to get a little bit extra, you might say more than their fair share, because they are dealing with issues that a more compact district does not deal with, especially when you're dealing, unless you set aside money specifically for this, but with transportation issues and how large those districts are compared to Washoe and Clark.
That's an interesting point I hadn't thought of. What aspects of a school district scale towards efficiency? And are there any aspects of a school district that, when it grows, scale towards inefficiency? You named, for example, transportation as probably being something costlier to a smaller district. What other advantages do larger school districts have from the monetary view?
Well, I think having been in both big districts and small districts in my career, the advantage that a big district has from the business side in streamlining. Now, I wouldn't want to take away the various state boards, district boards, responsibilities and ability to control funding. But I think, and this is just something that I have thought of in the past, I haven't been able to really bring it forward as in the legislature yet, although if a legislator came up with it, I'd be certainly willing to talk about it and help them with it. But I would like to see combinations of the districts in their business departments and being able to combine those, so you don't have to have a assistant superintendent or a supervisor of accounting at every district. You could have like 3 or 4 of the smaller districts, if they were willing to do this. I'm not saying force it on them, but if they were willing to do this and get together and form like a consortium, and one district be the parent and control all of the accounting for those other districts that are part of them, ensuring that all get an equal share. So you're not saying that the one that's the parent gets the big portion, but that way you're combining efficiencies. And you could even do that with the curriculum departments and others, maybe some of your area superintendents or assistant superintendents, however you want to look at it, and combine that efficiency in administration.
I'm wondering now, beyond school funding and allocation of funds, with regards to school reform, what are some of the things you'd like to see at least considered for change in our system? Everything from, the smallest way we approach how to teach a student in the classroom to large-scale changes in the way we actually structure education. Is there anything that you see that we can be doing differently to cause improvement?
I think being open to different educational models. Right now, the state, through the legislature, and it's passed, I believe may have been as far back as Governor Gwynn. I'm not sure exactly when, because I wasn't here at that point. But with what has been passed with Common Core and the way that those models are presented, as long as certain standards are met, I would have no problem with using models that other states have used at the district's discretion, being able to implement those. I also feel, having seen this in other districts, I worked at one district where the president of the union in that district was very happy and always bragged about the fact that she had passed her tenure years before and should have been fired. Her last year before she retired, she was a first grade teacher and tried to flunk half her class because they weren't making progress. When you have that many students not making progress, I don't think it's the students, I think it's the teachers. And although I do believe teachers need to have some protection, I think there has to be methods of us being streamlined methods of us being able to document and find those teachers who are not being affected and get rid of them. Wherever I worked in private industry for a while as well as in school districts. I was always at will. They could fire me anytime, and yet we can't do that to the teachers. And I think that is wrong when you have teachers that are not being effective.
Yeah, I think it's 3 years of at will for teachers, and then once they acquire their post-probationary status, it's quite a lengthy process. I'm curious, you brought up teachers. Do you see the shortfall of qualified teachers, particularly in the state of Nevada? Now I'm thinking of Clark County. I recall, it might have been 2 years ago, seeing a headline that there was something north of 1,000 open teacher positions, and the school year had already started. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the profession of teaching and the shortage we're seeing in Nevada.
Well, and again, raising us to at least the national average and expending less on administration would provide for teachers being able to make more money. I think that's part of it. I think also the fact that we have especially in Washoe and Clark, a disproportionate number of students who are having a great deal of problems, whether it's with coming from families with only one parent, coming from families where they may have little English ability, spoken at home, and so there's not the it's they're learning just at school and not being able to learn at home. And I think that has a big that is a major problem in our state, especially as I have been told. I've been told this. I don't know this for a fact, but a big portion of the reason why we have such a large immigrant population is because of the wages paid down in Clark and up here in Washoe.
And wages meaning
those
they're
who
healthy
do not
wages?
have maybe a lot of experience, and they're working in occupations where they don't need a lot of experience, like housekeeping and such.
Okay, so like just a large service sector then, essentially,
Right.
would bring, and we have huge disparities in socioeconomic backgrounds among students. So I'm wondering how you think we should conceptualize those differences we see in the performance between those groups. For example, how should the public school system respond when students from a lower socioeconomic background reliably perform below students from mid to high socioeconomic backgrounds? And let's make the factor of income the deciding factor here. So let's just imagine for a moment that all other factors are equal. Everyone's, got the same English proficiency as you cite. So the only disparity here is family income. Reliably, from what I can tell, students from the lower income households tend to perform a bit lower than students from mid to high. So how should we think of that, and how should we respond?
I think part of it has to do with encouraging teachers to go to those lower income places and schools and not having it affect negatively their career. Maybe a way of having teachers go to spend 1 year at a lower income school, and then a couple of years at a more prosperous school, and then rotate like that. So everyone is working at both the higher socioeconomic and the lower socioeconomic, so it doesn't negatively affect their evaluations over time, because they're given the opportunity to positively affect the lower economic, but then also be in a area where they can also be of great benefit to those who have the resources from home and from the local community to be able to star and have their students star.
I'm curious.
And right,
oh, go ahead.
That, I don't see that way, that being a possibility, but I would like to see a way for that to maybe become more of a norm. More so, obviously, in Washoe and Clark because of their standards versus, the rural districts where that you don't see that big a disparity, at least from what I've seen.
I'm curious, how do you think working in a school that serves lower income students negatively impacts the evaluations? If it does that mean there's something wrong with the way we evaluate teachers?
Part of this is based on the districts I worked in previously and what I hear from other teachers, but because they're coming from a low social and economic, or maybe especially if they are coming from a very low ESL, English as a second language, and having trouble to learning English, I think that it does affect, because a lot of the a portion of the evaluation is based on the level of improvement of the students in the classroom. And if the students are having a hard time and struggling with learning the language in the first place, or dealing with situations where they may, even at a very young age, have to go home and have a job instead of being able to work on their homework, I think that does have an effect on how the students learn, and thus how the teachers are evaluated. And this is another wild thing I thought of at one point. I don't know how possible it would be, but what I'd like to see is, for every family that has ESL students, to be able, that we would have, it would probably have to be a state grant or even a federal grant, but provide a way for all of them to have a copy of one of these language programs that would teach them English, so that you could have the parents learning it while the students are. Now, obviously, there are going to be some parents, I've had experience with this in the schools I've worked with, where parents don't care if their kids learn English or not. But if you have a way for those who do want to learn English through, and I've seen dozens of programs where they teach, you can learn Spanish and German and French. Well, why couldn't you have one for English to help the Spanish folks learn that language, and have that not just for the student, but also for the family, and thus that helps the overall education also.
So in your view, do we need to make adjustments to the way teachers are evaluated if there's even an inkling that they might be penalized in some way for working at a one school over another? Do we need to make adjustments there?
Yes, I do believe that, and that's why I would think that rotating teachers without penalizing them, and even in some cases in the larger districts, if you need to provide a stipend for them to travel from where they live to a district that may be at the outskirts, so that they're not penalized financially also for teaching at these other places. But it becomes easy to keep your good teachers at a good school, and they don't, they're doing well. They're showing improvement in their students, and maybe having, especially in high school, maybe having many of their students become advanced placement students, and going to the better universities in the country, and doing well at UNR and UNLV. Being able to have those teachers influence the students that are at the other places, and that's why I feel that moving them around so that there's no disadvantage to working at a particular school would be advantageous. Because if everyone's working at some part of their career in those lower socioeconomic schools, and everyone's working also at the higher economic, then everyone's treated the same, because they're all going to be evaluated. They're spending roughly the same amount of time at a place where they may have to struggle teaching and a place where they're not having to struggle as much.
Earlier in the conversation, you alluded to the idea of providing more money than might be typically applied for the average student for students who are in special education. So I've heard proposals, and I don't think these were approved, but proposals such as a 2x multiple on the per pupil guaranteed amount for students in special education, and maybe a 1.5 for students who are learning English. And then I've even heard some proposals for some kind of multiple for gifted and talented, students identified as gifted and talented. And I'm wondering if you feel as though an economy that provides a lot of lower income jobs, if that makes us as a society a bit more responsible to providing multiples of that kind to better serve students from lower socioeconomic households. And I say that only because, as you pointed out, a lot of the students from the lower socioeconomic households are trying to learn English, and it is more expensive for a school system to provide those additional resources. So do we need to be looking at just straight up multiples in the way we fund?
I think that is beneficial, and there have been conversations on that, and that I think is more appropriate than having some of these grants like the Victory grants and some of these others that we have. Tailor it to the specific students and number of students, and being able to, rather than having it go to the district in the particular school, maybe rather than declaring a school a Victory school, look at how many classrooms in there have students from that disadvantaged area. Because maybe you have a mixture. Maybe you have some middle income and some lower income, and you have a school declared as a Victory, as a getting extra funding for the low social economic, even though they have a good proportion of those who come from a higher economic. And so I see tailoring that to, and again, with the special education in that area. And this may get me in trouble with some folks on the special ed side, but having seen this, there are levels of special education that we look at. There are some students who are so far along the spectrum that basically what we've come down to is that schools become a place for babysitting to give the parents a few hours of respite. And I'm talking about the severely handicapped, the ones who may not even be able to communicate, the ones who have severe disabilities. I would like to see more funding for the students that are educatable and can be trained. And part of this comes with the trades, where I think we need to do more. If you can teach a kid to learn a trade when he doesn't want, the emphasis now, it seems to be so much on, and we are working on it at the board level, but so much on getting a degree at the university level. I think being able to train kids, whatever economic level they're from and whatever educational spectrum they come from, to, if they want to go to trade, put them in that, so that by the time they graduate from high school, they're able to become a journeyman and not have to spend time as an apprentice. Just as we need to prepare our students better so that when they go to college, whether a community college or UNR or UNLV or some of these other colleges that we have, it's ridiculous that we have so many students that are taking remedial education classes because they didn't learn it in high school. And that, if we stopped that, then that would also lower the costs at our universities and our colleges, because they wouldn't have to have as many students, spending a year or more in a remedial classes.
Yeah, that's a system-wide change that I think is gaining a lot of traction just in terms of, providing multiple pathways to really some very good paying jobs that are available given proper training that may not include, a 4-year bachelor's degree. But I have to go back. I was actually expecting you to go the opposite way when you were discussing students with intense special needs. I just ask you to clarify that. Are you saying we should be reallocating funds from those programs to students in special education who might make different kinds of progress, or are you saying you just like to see a net increase for it all? Could you explain that?
I think the ones that can be trained, we should have enough allocated that they could be trained. If they can learn enough that they could go to a community college, that's great. If they are able to learn a trade, that's great. If they're just able to learn to take care of themselves past the point when their family is no longer around to help them, I think you need to look at each level, and then there are some that it may come a time when there's going to be, when the family passes on, the parents pass on, where because of their disability, somebody is going to have to take care of them, and having do we have enough state resources? And this is not from the education side, but the social service side. Do we have enough resources for those people to be taken care of, rather than living out on the street in homeless shelters, which I think, not all, but I think a portion of them are coming from that area.
And so if that care begins in the public school system, that's a care that you're saying we need to fund healthily. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think and just as much as we would spend on the gifted and talented, the GATE students, we need to ensure that our special ed students get the same degree of care. They're all important.
It's interesting you bring up gifted and talented education, because I know I think it's the last 4 years, or there's been grants provided to school districts to service those students identified as GT. I'm wondering how you feel about the GT population in Nevada, if we have adequate programming, adequate funding to support those learners who really need a different set of opportunities, perhaps, or I should say maybe just a different environment to really go at the level they can go at. How are we doing in Nevada with that?
I don't have enough experience in hearing stories and facts on that area, but I have watched, because I moved here in 2012, I have watched the amount that has been dedicated to increasing funding for our GATE population. And so I think that is not a bad thing. And I think the emphasis also towards programs where a student can graduate with a high school and a community college degree, an AA at the same time, is immensely important. And that doesn't just affect, I think, the GATE students, it affects others also. But if you can go to UNR or UNLV and already have 2 years under your belt, that's going to make it a lot cheaper to go to college and even possibly getting a master's or doctorate if that's your desire.
I know you mentioned stumbling across, or I think we had emailed about this, sort of stumbling across David's book and the local school board meeting, and I'm wondering if his notion of age-based education, just kind of, asking the question, why do we bother grouping kids according to age? Aren't there better attributes of students that we could use to effectively group? I'm wondering what your thoughts are on a system-wide change as radical as that, and how that might play into meeting some of the special needs we've been discussing.
Well, and I think part of that is something that can be looked at. I don't know if that's something that you can just blow up and create, but in looking at his book, I do agree with that, and that is part of the reason why we have these programs for GATE and that, because it's trying to pull those students out a little bit and give them a little bit more help. But why, like he was talking about, why don't we look at a way of evaluating students even at the pre-K level and deciding, well, okay, this student has regressed enough that even though he's only 4 years old, maybe he belongs in first grade, while a student that is 7 and is struggling more needs to be still in kindergarten. I think, and part of that is going to take a mindset with everybody, because you're going to have to get away from looking at age and saying, well, you're this age and so you should be in this grade, instead of looking at where they stand from their mind. In some respects, it's like looking at girls and boys with the way that they develop emotionally and maturely in the mind. Many studies have said that girls mature a lot faster than the boys do. Well, if that's the case, then maybe we need to look at that also overall, in the overall picture, and maybe in some respects we'd have, at least initially, some of the girls in a higher grades than the boys, but gradually, as that emphasis goes towards pushing those students up, eventually you would possibly catch up and even surpass, so that there's how can I say this? There's less emphasis on the physical age and more on the mental age and the mature age, and where that places them on the educational spectrum.
Well, I'm now increasingly mindful of our time, and I can't thank you enough for you sharing some of your time with us today. It's been vastly interesting to me, and I've obtained a sense through our conversation that you're really responsive to hearing from your constituents in terms of the information you have. It comes from the stories you hear and the information you're provided. So I'm wondering if you have a mechanism whereby folks in Northern Nevada can interact with you, and if you are willing to share that, that'd be wonderful. And then for our listeners outside of Nevada, if you have any advice for just a typical person, a parent, a teacher, even a student who wants to interact with educational policy, should they be considering first, probably most people just need to figure out who their state board member is. So if you have any advice for them in that respect, that'd be great.
First, your school board members are based on the congressional district. So my area matches Mr. Amadei. And so in Nevada, we have 4 elected representatives. And so each of those matches the congressional district. My email address is Carter, Carter, 4, the number 4, NV for Nevada, DOE for Department of Education, @gmail.com. I can also be reached at and stripes, like the flag, spelled out, .carter @gmail.com, and I would answer for either of those.
And that was Stars and Stripes, you said?
Like the flag, yes. STARSANDSTRIPES.Carter.
Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, there are several ways you can support our work. First and foremost, you can subscribe to our podcast via iTunes Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or just using our RSS feed. And giving us reviews helps more than you think. If you want to provide direct support, we have a support tab on our main page, we'redoingitwrong.com, that links to our Patreon account. Patreon's a neat system that allows you to pledge a dollar amount per episode produced and set a monthly maximum. So you only pay when you get new content you love. But most importantly, we just appreciate your listenership. Thank you.